listen, you can hear their hearts beating loud. Can't keep those California Indians down.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to American Indian Airwaves. For Marcus Lopez, I'm your host, Larry Smith.
Interestingly enough, one of the major priorities of these so-called secessionists was further stealing and pilfering the land of Native Americans. The problem that they faced was that the Comanches, in particular, were no joke as warriors. They were the so-called lords of the plains. And one of the reasons why the history of Texas has been so bloody is precisely because the Comanches put up one of the most spirited rebellions and wars against these invaders and secessionists as any other Native American grouping.
Today on American Indian Airwaves, an in-depth interview with noted scholar Dr. Gerald Horne on the counter-revolution of 1836, Texas slavery and Jim Crow, and the roots of U.S. Fascism, and how it impacts Native Americans throughout the region. All that and more here on American Indian Airwaves.
You can hear when the moon shines bright, the lone fool in the black of the night. You can hear the whisper in the valley. And you know when Kamakani blows to the Bahu drum, it's the warriors who are marching down the mountain, because history ain't no mystery to me.
Today on American Indian Airwaves, Marcus Lopez, co-host and executive producer of American Indian Airwaves, and myself have the honor and pleasure to speak with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's an eminent historian who is also chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is an author of more than 30 books and 100 scholarly articles and reviews. His research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, war, and the film industry. Marcus Lopez and myself have the honor and pleasure to speak with Dr. Gerald Horne on his book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. This is Dr. Gerald Horne.
Revolution of 1836 mirrors the title of a previous book I wrote, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. And in both instances, the land of Native Americans is at issue. That is to say, with regard to 1776, one of the reasons why real estate speculator number one, George Washington, rebelled against London's rule was because London, in the so-called Royal Proclamation of 1763, had raised doubt as to whether or not it would continue to subsidize wars against Native Americans moving westward from the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. That, along with this suspicion that London had gone wobbly on the question of abolition of slavery, which, of course, enraged the slave owners led by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison et al., that helped to ignite the rebellion against British rule that established the United States of America. Likewise, with regard to the counter-revolution of 1836, in the late 1820s, you had a Mexican president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, 200 years before Barack Obama, by the way, and he spearheaded the abolition of enslavement of Africans south of the border. That enraged the so-called Anglo-colonists led by, once again, slave owners like Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, who then rebelled against Mexican rule because Texas, or Tejas, had been a province of Mexico up until the secession led by these men, who then ostentatiously affixed their names to the leading cities in the state of Texas, speaking of Houston and Austin. And then they succeeded, not least because of assistance from the United States of America. which obviously saw this secessionist rebellion as a kindred experiment, so to speak. Interestingly enough, one of the major priorities of these so-called secessionists was further stealing and pilfering the land of Native Americans. The problems that they faced was that the Comanches, in particular, were no joke as warriors. They were the so-called lords of the plains. And one of the reasons why the history of Texas has been so bloody is precisely because the Comanches put up one of the most spirited rebellions and wars against these invaders and secessionists as any other Native American grouping. In that context, I should also mention the Caddo, C-A-D-D-O, who had an interlocking directorate with Black people, which also helped to strengthen their resistance against the creators of this rebel nation, then state known as Texas. Interestingly enough, that helps to facilitate the fact that with Texas bordering Mexico, Mexico welcomed and embraced the enslaved Africans who were fleeing across the border. Thousands did so, by the way, and oftentimes they were assisted by Native American groupings on both sides of the border. What happens, of course, is that encourages a tendency that probably would have ensued in any case, which is that Texas, which became an independent country between 1836 and 1845, also pioneered in terms of the African slave trade. The Lone Star flag of Texas could be found off the coast of Angola in Southwest Africa. Texas, in the independent sense, was a major importer of enslaved Africans to Cuba, a major importer of enslaved Africans to Brazil. The problem for independent Texas was that it could not stand up to worldwide abolitionist pressure. That is to say, pressure not only from progressive forces in North America, not least indigenous groupings, but also revolutionary Haiti, which had broken away from French colonial rule by 1804 and had set up the first Black Republic, not to mention the abolitionist forces then embedded in London. And so Texas crawled into the United States of America in 1845, where it has been ever since, although, as you probably know, there's been a lot of loose talk of late of Texas resuming its independence.
Gerald, in the book, there's a group of people that are pejoratively or negatively referred to as mulattoes, which is a very antiquated and problematic term, and they get used as kind of an intermediary for settler colonial control and mechanisms and systems of violence. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about them and how they fit into this historical narrative that you so eloquently have articulated in your book.
Well, that term is rather archaic nowadays. It referred to so-called mixed race people, particularly combinations of Africans and Europeans. They had an anomalous position in the racist hierarchy that existed north of the border, that is to say, in the United States of America. I spent some time talking about a so-called mulatto named Charles Gaillard, who had roots in Louisiana. Louisiana, in some ways, was the headquarters of this subgroup. And yet, during the U.S. Civil War, when the slave owners, particularly in Texas, fought against the Lincoln government between 1861 and 1865, one of the many reasons why Texas emerged from that conflict less damaged than other states and well-positioned to take a role, which it did, as a preeminent enforcer of U.S. apartheid or Jim Crow, was because Charles Gaillard, this so-called mulatto, was based in Mexico, in Tampico, and ran a operation that was able to smuggle goods into Texas, and then those goods were then dispensed throughout the so-called Confederacy. Speaking of the U.S. Civil War, I should also mention that one of the reasons why Texas emerged relatively undamaged from the U.S. Civil War was that France, which had helped to assist Texas' secession from Mexico in the first instance in 1836, then helped to topple the regime in Mexico City and seize power under the puppet leader, Maximilian. But what happened was that Benito Juarez, a Mexican leader with substantial indigenous heritage and ancestry, led a campaign against him, and he was joined, I'm happy to say, by black soldiers of the U.S. military who executed a crushing pincers maneuver against the puppet forces, which helped to restore Mexican sovereignty. But alas, post-1865, I'm sure you're aware about how the black population in particular suffered grievously. Unfortunately, not as well known, at least in the United States, is how sadly and tragically the U.S. Civil War set the stage for intensified dispossession of the indigenous population. Despite the so-called sainted nature of Abraham Lincoln, we should never forget that during the midst of the Civil War, he was able to execute the deaths of dozens of Native American warriors who were resisting settler encroachment in the state now known as Minnesota. And post-1865, one of the central goals and tasks of Washington was to further expropriate Native American land, which led to crushing genocidal campaigns, not only against the aforementioned Comanches, but also against the Lakota due north. Also, you should know that the Texas regime, along with the U.S. government, spearheaded the war against Mexico once again, 1846 to 1848, that led to California, where you are now sitting, becoming a part of the United States and departing the jurisdiction of Mexico. And that helped to set in motion what the UCLA historian Benjamin Matley has called correctly a genocide against the indigenous population of the state of California, not only against the Chumash, who, as I'm sure you may know, have roots in the Southland, but due north, the so-called Modoc conflict, M-O-D-O-C, which your audience should familiarize themselves with, was one of the bloodiest genocidal campaigns, quite frankly, in the history of the world. And so the Civil War, even though I understand why it is celebrated in certain precincts in the United States, I can also understand why in what is oftentimes referred to as, quote, Indian country, unquote, is not necessarily viewed as this great leap forward.
Dr. Horn, you mentioned very appropriately about the this dynamic between the world geopolitics, if you will, and you're so right when you're talking about the California experience as far as these annexation, Civil War, and California participation within that, with the North and dynamics with North and the South. But when reading the book, the counter revolution of 1836 and Texas slavery and the Jim Crow and the roots of U.S. Fascism, I got the impression when I read it, what impressed me in your writing, we can't go over all that because it's a compact book, by the way. But when you were talking about annexation, when you're talking about slavery, when you're talking about these powers that are influential personalities and so on and so forth, you describe very rightfully all the indigenous nations that are not known within Texas that got wiped out. The Comanches is part of that, and many of just like the South, a lot of Native people within the South got eliminated because, like you talked about, this Jackson character that plotted during the administration about consuming more land and annexation or stealing more land. Talk about this notion of, you wrote many instances when the battle of indigenous populations and many tribal entities within Texas. It's a large area in New Mexico, and Arizona, in which Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico was Mexico before it was all these different countries. But that set the basis. Your Southern Confederacy set the basis for all what you're describing.
And you're listening to American Indian Airwaves. We're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne on his book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And now back to the interview.
Talk about what the importance of that, the importance of understanding these dynamics where it eliminated many indigenous people. It consolidated and tried to disengage the abolitionists, trying to completely challenge Mexico as a country where the Confederacy even set up shop within Mexico. Talk about that for our listeners.
Well, first of all, as your comment tended to suggest, early on in the book, I give a very dispiriting listing of the different Native American groupings who were virtually wiped out, virtually extinguished, almost extinguished from historical memory and the historical record as a result of the bloody depredations in the state of Texas. I'm afraid to say that you may be able to compile a similar list with regard to the indigenous groupings in the so-called Golden State, speaking of California. And that brings us to a major path set out by the European settlers, which was to liquidate Native Americans so that they could grab the land. Now, this liquidation took a number of forms, and not only took the form of war. One of the many revelations that has emerged in recent scholarship is the question of enslavement of the indigenous population. In fact, this took place from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but also, interestingly enough, the enslavers, the European enslavers, just as they imported the enslaved from Africa, and also black people by way of Cuba as well, they deported the indigenous population, exported the indigenous population, particularly to the slave markets of Turkey, Constantinople. And that's one of the reasons why the DNA of indigenous Americans can be found dispersed widely. And this makes ever more curious the fact that even people in the United States who consider themselves to be radical or left or revolutionary celebrate the creation of the United States of America, despite it being a mastermind of mass enslavement and genocide. And that brings me to the subtitle of the book we're discussing, the subtitle being The Roots of U.S. Fascism, The Roots of American Fascism. And that is something which I'm afraid to say we're staring down the barrel of in 2023. However, we cannot begin to understand that bracing prospect without understanding this history, because a country that pioneered in genocide obviously has the gumption and the wherewithal to execute a further genocide, which is a hallmark of fascism in the 21st century. A country that pioneered and masterminded the question of mass enslavement obviously has the gumption and wherewithal to execute that gruesome, dastardly, diabolical task once again in the 21st century. And I should say, on the class level, that you cannot understand what befell the indigenous population of North America without understanding class collaboration amongst the settlers. That is to say, being sponsored by the 1%, but I'm afraid to say the 99% felt that they had a material interest in going along with this bloody program. And so this book is not only a rather, shall we say, bracing tale of history, but it also, I would hope, presents a roadmap for the future so that we can avoid and our grandchildren and children can avoid the tragedies of the past that continue to shape us.
And you're listening to Dr. Gerald Horne on his new book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. We will hear more from Dr. Horne shortly here on American Indian Airwaves. We ask that longtime and new listeners of American Indian Airwaves and KPFK to continue to support the work that we do by picking up the book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism as a $100 thank you item. And you can pick up the book by visiting the kpfk.org website and clicking on the KPFK Fund Drive widget. It's a $100 thank you item. There is KPFK T-shirts and mugs that are available for only a $50 thank you item. We ask that you support the work that we do. KPFK is 100% listener supported, and without your contributions, KPFK, its volunteered programmers and staff members cannot bring you the diversified range of voices and vast array of issues that we cover. Marcus?
Yes, Larry, we want to thank everybody. First of all, our listeners from San Diego, Kumeyaay country, all the way to Point Conception and Chumash land, that all the Tongva, the Cahuilla, the Tatavian, the San Fernando people, all the different people, Cupa and Luceño and Hashaman and Tongva, obviously, that the airways that we go over, we want to reach out to them. And this book really, we're going to explain it later on, but really encapsulates the nature of this right-wing Trumpism kind of phenomena, this fascistic phenomena that's going on in the United States. Keep tuned, because we're going to mention, and as well as Dr. Gerald Horne is going to mention some of the things that are really pertinent to California history. Larry.
Thank you, Marcus. And yeah, we want to remind listeners that the book, which you can pick up as a $100 thank you item, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism by Dr. Gerald Horne. We'll talk more about the book in the next break, but this book, for those of you that are just interested in history, global history, interested in colonial or early United States history, for those of you interested in the enslavement of African Americans and the enslavement and dispossession and killing of indigenous peoples throughout Texas and the southeast into Mexico, all those geopolitics at play with each other. This is the book to pick up and read. There's over 600 pages of invaluable information. Again, it's a $100 thank you item. It's called The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of American Fascism by Dr. Gerald Horne. You can pick it up on the kpfk.org website and click dead center on the KPFK Fund Drive widget and pick up the book. And now, Marcus, we continue our interview with Dr. Gerald Horne on the Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. So I appreciate you bringing up slavery and indigenous peoples. And correct me if I'm wrong. For example, in the port of Charleston, in what we know as South Carolina, pre-1735, I think more Native American or indigenous men were, to crassly put it, exported than Afro-indigenous men being brought to the colonial territories. And so in the book, there's a lot of references to Native Americans to African Americans that have Native American ancestors. And there's this historical relationship between African Americans and Native Americans. And I was wondering if you could touch on that in the context of your book.
Well, first of all, I don't want to clutter our conversation, but I should mention another book by the UCLA historian Kyle Mays entitled Afro-Indigenous History of the United States of America. And by the way, I interviewed him on KPFK some months ago, and if you're a diligent user of a search engine, you can probably find an interview, because there has been this historic bond between people of African descent and people of indigenous descent. I mentioned the Caddo, C-A-D-D-O, a few moments ago, but they're hardly alone. Certainly, if you venture into the history of Oklahoma, you will encounter a history of Afro-Indigenous relations. But to turn the coin over, and speaking of Oklahoma, I would be derelict if I failed to mention the tragic history of the Cherokee, who tried to assimilate and adapt to the settler regime. Many of them converted to Christianity. Many of them adopted the dress and sartorial choices of the settlers. Many of them engaged in a kind of agriculture compatible with the settler regime. However, in the early 1830s, under the aforementioned regime of the villainous Andrew Jackson, they still had to embark on the Trail of Tears. And once again, what that meant was that they were subjected to expulsion, moving supposedly to the land of the Indians, speaking of Indian Territory, or Oklahoma as was called before statehood in 1907. And oftentimes they abandoned mansions, and European settlers, fresh off the boat, moved into their mansions. But the dark side, pardon the expression, of the Cherokee experience was that they also adapted insofar as they enslaved Africans. And many of them they brought with them to Indian territory and to Oklahoma. And so what happens is that during the U.S. Civil War, many Cherokee leaders, I'm speaking of Stand Watie, W-A-T-I-E, there are biographies of him in profusion, they fought alongside the Confederates, the slave owners. And I think that they did not trust the Lincoln government because, of course, Lincoln government, like most Washington governments, they spoke in a farrago of lies, and they did not trust them to keep any of their promises or maintain their treaties. But alas, what happens is that after the Confederates are defeated, the Cherokees are made to disgorge more of their wealth to the enslaved Africans than any of the so-called European slave owners. And that leads to a certain kind of temporary enrichment of these so-called Cherokee freedmen. But I'm sure you know how the story concludes. Approximately 100 years ago, there was the Tulsa Massacre, Tulsa, Oklahoma, to be sure, where many of these Cherokee freedmen, black people, had their wealth plundered, pillaged, and stolen by settlers and were plunged into poverty. Hundreds, perhaps, were killed. They're still looking for their cadavers and their caskets and corpses. And that is a kind of ignominious punctuation of the oftentimes star-crossed relationship between the Cherokees and black people.
Yeah, I think when Dr. Horn, you're talking about this history is a sense of, it's not a one line. It has many divergence and many conflicting individuals' personalities and political forces that are at play. We talked about a little bit about, obviously, indigenous people are not homogeneous. They're very, very different from different localities, and Choctaws and Cherokees and slavery versus the other indigenous people throughout the whole area. Because when you look at the area, it's very vast. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, very vast. Oklahoma territory was vast territory in which the solution for the United States government was to shove everybody in Oklahoma territory in order so they can go on with their business, which has many twists and turns within that. Talk about twists and turns. You mentioned earlier about the world, about, you mentioned a little bit about DNA. Talk about Paris' role. Talk about London's role within this and the dynamics. And I think what I liked about the book is that it wasn't just the southern centric or Texas alone, but how Texas, Mexico, London, Paris, Algeria, and all these different forces that are at play even North American, Anglo-American, if you will, of the United States conflicting with the Southern plantation powers of be, that all this was in that play of geopolitics with the Pacific. Talk about that, how you unweave this complicated but yet real-life story of this important time of U.S. history.
And you're listening to American Indian Airwaves. We're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne on his book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And now back to the interview.
Well, once again, let me reiterate and stress that I would like to think that this book also provides a roadmap for the future, a roadmap in terms of how we can dig ourselves out of the deep hole in which we find ourselves. What I mean is that if we are to deliver a justice of some sort to the indigenous groupings of North America who have suffered so grievously over the centuries under the tyrannical rule of the settler class, we're going to have to internationalize this question. We're going to have to take a geopolitical position. We're going to have to take this question to the United Nations. You know, I also did a book some years ago on the struggle of indigenous people of the nation now known as Zimbabwe against settler rule, once again from London. And what happened eventually was that the Africans, the indigenous people of Zimbabwe, were able to internationalize their struggle to the point where there was an international conference in London whereby the parties sat across the table and were able to negotiate an agreement. Because I think part of the problem in what is referred to as, quote, Indian country, unquote, is that these treaties, which are hardly worth the paper they're written on, have been negotiated directly with the settlers who have found it useful to disregard these treaties on the slightest excuse or slightest pretense. In order to prevent that from happening, I think we're going to have to internationalize the struggle, have a third party at the table, perhaps the United Nations, as a guarantor that any pacts or accords are maintained and kept, which brings us back to Texas, because I think, you might have noticed that occasionally in the pages of this book at hand, I'm wondering why there was not much more of an outreach to the international community, not only by the black population, but also by the indigenous population, because it was apparent early on that the settlers were not operating in good faith. Having said that, I do point out, as noted, the role of revolutionary Haiti in terms of putting pressure on slave owners in the hemisphere, because Haiti feared that as long as slavery obtained in North America, it could return with a vengeance to the Caribbean, jeopardizing their sovereignty and livelihood. I talk about the mass movement in London against slavery for various reasons, and time does not allow me to go into why that existed. I talk about the role of France. Interestingly enough, as noted, there was a de facto alliance between enslavers and France for a good deal of the 19th century. And indeed, I point out how the enslavers studied the role of France in Algeria. Recall that France colonized the sprawling North African nation circa 1830, just as Native Americans, particularly the Cherokee, were being expelled from the southeast quadrant of North America and the United States and embarking on the Trail of Tears. And likewise, you had, interestingly enough, the enslavers were so taken by the dispatch with which the French were liquidating North Africans and Algerians that they tried to emulate them up to and including bringing camels to Texas in order, because they thought that in desert lands, of which, Texas has quite a bit of desert, as does New Mexico and Arizona, that it would be useful to have camels. So I think that our opponents, our antagonists, have studied world history. They have relied upon global currents in order to affix their tyrannical rule upon our backs. And we need to respond by studying world history and developing a global movement that ultimately will deliver justice to our peoples.
And that was Dr. Gerald Horne speaking on his brand new book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. His brand new book that Marcus and we had the honor and pleasure to speak with. You can pick up his brand new book, over 600 pages of invaluable history, all related to settler colonialism, global political affairs, everything that's taking place within the late 1700s, the early 1800s. It's a phenomenal read. It's a $100 thank you item that you can pick up by visiting the kpfk.org website and clicking on the KPFK Fund Drive widget on the website. If $100 is a bit too much for you, we do have other thank you items that you can pick up for $50. That includes the KPFK t-shirt and or a mug for $50. Marcus?
Hey, Larry, one of the things that I want to just reach out to our listeners within Southern California, also on the podcast and the internet, kpfk.org, American Indian Airways. But this book is much more than what Dr. Horne talks about, even though he's passionate about what he wrote. Very knowledgeable, probably one of the few authors, Larry, that besides Jack Forbes or Stannard or Medley or Osborne, that talks about this history that no one talks about. Right. No one, when you go in ethnic studies, they don't talk about this. When you go to Indigenous studies, they don't talk about this. When you go and look at the roots of this fascistic nature, what I talked about earlier, he goes into it about this is a global phenomena: slavery, plantations, Confederacy, Paris, London, even Turkey. I mean, this is a phenomenal read. And many of the Native people that are studying Indigenous studies now, that they need to pick up this book and read it. Because why? Because in Texas alone, he mentions, for example, Dr. Horne mentions about the Trail of Tears, but there was many, many, many Trails of Tears, and there are many assaults and attacks and elimination of Native people within Texas, and also Native people that this Confederacy and this fascistic nature of this realm within Mexico, within Matamoros, or within the Guatemala, and really within Brazil, that signifies, and this really gives us the lessons about how deep this is. Number one, this fascistic law, and this notion of this Jim Crowism, but that's going on to the very day through the voting. But yet, I think this is one of the things, Larry, that we want to present this to our listeners. We think and we feel that our listeners are part of the population, indigenous population, that wants to know more, that wants to gravitate around this notion of colonial settler society. When young people talk about de-indigenized, and we talk about indigenization, and when we're talking about the decolonized, what I mean, within this realm, we have to know the history of the land. A lot of the Chumash people, a lot of the Native people don't know their own history. And the point of the matter, or only look at the authorities that don't look like Dr. Horne talks about the counter-revolution of 1836. Here, 1836.
Thank you, Marcus. We want to remind listeners they can pick up the book by visiting the kpfk.org website, clicking on the KPFK Fund Drive widget, and pick up Dr. Gerald Horne's book for $100 as a way to say thank you. And now we want to go back to our interview with Dr. Gerald Horne.
Thank you very much for that, because this is what, when I read the book, all of it, that it poses more questions. At the same time, it gives you what you kept repeating yourself, and that is a roadmap. Well, one of the things about roadmap, you might have one junction, and you kind of go in the wrong direction as another junction, but yet this book in itself is a rich material as you articulate certain points of history and individuals. It goes on to the individuals that are the obstruction of liberation, at the same time collaborators with liberation of different areas, and where Mexico played a pivotal role within that, and that because of the Mexican-American War and because of the different treaties that what you said is not the worth of paper they're written on, but yet this mechanism, what do you see in the future when you talked about the internationalization of these issues? We once again try to go to the United Nations, indigenous people, and have different caucuses and whatnot. What is so important about this history that we're talking about, this one book? What do you see as this roadmap? UN, do you see the native peoples of the Americas coming together and making a declaration, like we have the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples? What's your vision?
Well, let's start there, and let's also mention the Treaty Council. Let us mention also the various efforts by indigenous populations to take their struggle to the international community. This is not something that's necessarily unique to the indigenous population of North America. It's something that you've also seen in the indigenous population of the Americas generally. Listeners should know that as we speak, I'm reading a new book by Caroline Dodds Pinnock, On Savage Shores, How Indigenous Americans Discovered Europe. It's about how from the beginning of the invasion of this continent, you had indigenous people who were dispatched to European capitals to lobby against the incursion onto their soil. This happened for hundreds of years. This happened for centuries. And what's striking is that it had some impact, although obviously it could have had a more positive impact. But I think that our ancestors have also created a roadmap. We need, in this world of supersonic transport and instantaneous communication through the internet and the establishment of the United Nations headquarters on Manhattan Island, we need to take advantage of all of those factors in order to put pressure on this settler government in Washington, not to mention its companion settler governments in places like Austin, Texas, and Sacramento, California, because I think that is an essential part of our ongoing struggle.
Dr. Hunt, you mentioned this notion of this North America and the world. Different authors come up with the idea that United States of America is different, similar to Canada, similar to New Zealand, and similar to Great Britain or England did, is that United States is not a country, its nation state is not a country, unlike, for example, like China, one civilization. It was created, and this is what I got from your book, the fact that it was the only nation state, Australia, Canada, United States, and New Zealand, that had eliminated its people or attempted to eliminate its people in order to create its own state, its own apparatus in the image of their own nation, where they came from, a nation of immigrants, you might say. How do you take a look at that? Do you akin to that notion about this country is not a country, a word like any other country, but yet country where they exterminated peoples in order to get territory?
Well, sure, that is precisely what was attempted. And once again, we should also study the lesson of failed settler regimes. As noted, the French in North Africa and Algeria had incorporated Algeria as a so-called province of France, just like Hawaii
And you're listening to American Indian Airwaves. We're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne on his book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And now back to the interview.
Has been incorporated as a so-called 50th state of the United States of America. But what happened was that the Algerian forces were able to mobilize and organize in order to repel the dastardly plans of the Parisian colonizers and therefore establish their sovereignty by 1962. Likewise, there was an attempt by the British in East Africa to establish a settler regime in Kenya, East Africa. If you're ever able to visit Nairobi, the capital of this independent African state, you will be surprised by how temperate the climate is. Unlike West Africa, for example, Nigeria, where you had British colonizers, but not necessarily a settler state, but Nigeria had the kind of weather that was not agreeable to the British, unlike Kenya. But in Kenya, the Africans were able to mobilize, were able to establish solidarity with black people in North America and in fact in the Caribbean as well, and were able to defeat settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is not necessarily an eternal phenomenon. I think it is still possible to discuss credibly the defeat of settler colonialists in North America. But once again, it will involve a major global outreach and mobilization.
Yeah, I was going to ask you today, when we're doing this interview, actually marks the 47th year that, or 47 years ago, that Canada extradited international Native American political prisoner Leonard Peltier. And I was just wondering if your thoughts on that, if you have anything to share with us, and how that relates to the origins of American fascism, as you so eloquently convey in your book.
Well, interestingly enough, I should have shared this with you earlier. I'm in the Southland, and just a few hours ago, I was doing research for another book at the California State University at Dominguez Hills, which, as you know, is in South LA. And if you go to special collections on the 5th floor of the library, you'll see a wonderful exhibit depicting the life of the great Leonard Peltier. And of course, what befell him is something that's befallen warriors too numerous to mention. Speaking of projects, in terms of my various research initiatives, I've noticed that the British in particular, they deported the most prominent warriors in Africa, particularly in West Africa, all the way across the continent into the Indian Ocean archipelago of the Seychelles, for example. And it occurred to me that someone should do research on what happened to those warriors in the Seychelles. You know that in so-called British India, they deported many of the most prominent warriors to these islands off the southeastern coast of India. So once again, I think if we were to understand the Native American experience, we have to understand also analogous experiences, because we can learn from those experiences. We can learn about how they defeated those who were seeking to subjugate them and apply those lessons right here in North America, so that we can finally bring justice to the indigenous population and deliver a stinging blow to this ongoing settler regime.
And that was Dr. Gerald Horne speaking on the counter-revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. It's his brand new book. You can pick it up as a $100 thank you item by visiting the kpfk.org website and clicking on the KPFK Fund Drive widget and pick up the book for $100 as a way to say thank you for the work that we do here on American Indian Airwaves as a way to say thank you to all the volunteer staff and paid staff here at KPFK. If you appreciate the marginalized, unheard voices that we bring to our program here on American Indian Airwaves and throughout KPFK, please support us. We are 100% listener supported. There are no corporate underwriters. There are no foundational underwriters. KPFK and the work that the volunteer programmers do is just that, volunteers with the support of all of you as listeners. So thank you for those of you who continue to listen to American Indian Airwaves, and we ask that you continue to support us and KPFK by picking up Dr. Gerald Horne's book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism, as a $100 thank you item. Marcus?
Hey, Larry, this book is phenomenal. And now it talks about annexation before, in the counter-revolution, 1836, and then the outgrowth of the Confederacy, slaveocracy, and that whole plantation of a model, might say, of slavery and oppression of native peoples and land and African indigenous people. But it goes on, and it's just kind of like a roadmap, you might say, of where this country we call United States of America, this country unfolded, and it's the only country, one of the few countries of the world that started from the colonial settler model, Larry. And then we have to wrap our heads around that, and where the basis of it is the annihilation, elimination, or attempt annihilation. And that's why Dr. Horne talks about how he mentioned Benjamin Mendeley's book, Genocide, and that here, this notion of genocide, it puts more meat into the bone of this reactionary, fascistic nature, and really supports and also documents in a very detailed manner what we're experiencing and why things the way they are with this right wing, this fascistic nature, these fascist organizations that are trying to whip up this division between the white workers and the people of color workers in order to whip up the divisive factor, just similar to, not identical, but similar to what in Germany trying to split up peoples of color and this country, and then like the Jewish and the communists, the socialists, and the gay population within Germany. The Nazi Party was very successful in doing that, and implementation of that. We can see the parallels within this country. Larry, I'll give you an example. In this chapter, Texas, California, Golden Aftermath of the War, 1848 1851, he mentioned the question of green, and James Gatson, and also David Terry. And he said that green, for example, is upmost among the Chauvinists, quickly became potent force in California, along with other Texans. He sat in the first legislature in California and pushed the legislation establishing the University of California. James Galson, who gave his name to yet another land concessions ripped from Mexico, conspired with the Green to implement slavery in California. And I can go on, but I won't. You got to read it, Larry.
And they can read it by picking up the book at the kpfk.org website. Again, the book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism by Dr. Gerald Horne. You can visit the kpfk.org website, click on the KPFK Fund Drive widget, pick up the book for $100 as a way to say thank you to the work that we do here on American Indian Airwaves, as well as all the volunteer programmers here at KPFK and the paid staff here at KPFK. Again, we are 100% listener supported. There are no corporate underwriters. There are no grant or foundation underwriters. We are 100% supported by listeners like you. We thank all of you that have been listening to us here on American Indian Airwaves. We ask that you can, if you like the work that we continue to do here on American Indian Airwaves and KPFK, please support us and the station. Pick up Dr. Gerald Horn's book by visiting the kpfk.org website. Again, the book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. And as Marcus, as what you're saying, Dr. Gerald Horn does this phenomenal job in telling this textually rich history in relationship to the geopolitics, settler colonialism, African Americans and indigenous peoples throughout the region. And he just does a very fluid and seamless job in showing how everything interrelates and interconnects in the rise of American fascism during this time in history. And it's a phenomenal read. Again, it's a $100 thank you item. You can pick up The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism at kpfk.org and click on the KPFK Fund Drive widget, select the book, and say thank you for the work that we do and the work that KPFK volunteers and staff members do to bring you this community service.
The moment of silence is over.
And that was Dr. Gerald Horn on The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. It is his newest book that you, the listener, can pick up as a $100 thank you gift in support of the work that we do here at KPFK, along with all the volunteer programmers. You can pick up the book by visiting the kpfk.org website and select the KPFK Fund Drive widget and pick up the book there, along with other premium items such as $50 for a KPFK t-shirt or $50 for a KPFK mug, or you can become a monthly KPFK Sustainer Circle member by agreeing to make a monthly dollar denomination of your choice. That concludes our show for today here on American Indian Airwaves. A special thank you to our guest, Dr. Gerald Horn, and a special thank you to our musical guest, Aragon Star, Kupa Aina, and the band Blackfire. American Indian Airwaves is mixed and mastered in the studios of Burnt Swamp Studios in Signal Hill, California. For Marcus Lopez, I'm your host for the hour, Larry Smith. Until next time.
That must be heard. After all the lies and the empty promises, we take a stand on the land that you tried to bury us. For all the pain and all the suffering, we take a stand. We take a stand. We sleep caged against our fears.